Hi there, and welcome to Telefunken. In today's video, we're going to replace the electrolytic capacitors in a Roland TR-606. The Roland TR-606 is a programmable analog drum machine developed, manufactured, and marketed by Roland in the early 1980s, specifically between 1981 and 1984. It was designed to be paired with the now legendary Roland TB-303, a nondescript monophonic analog bass synthesizer to provide drum and bass accompaniment to guitarists and other performers in the absence of a backing band. Contemporaneous with the TR-808, the TR-606 shares a similar 16-step programming style and some of the less natural-sounding character of the 808. Although the sound of the 606 was considered a liability in the market at the time it was released, when people were comparing it to the more realistic-sounding, yet much more expensive, Lindrum, the 606 found favor among early experimental industrial bands and later made an impact in the development of the genres that became electro, techno, trip-hop, and IDM. While towards the end of the 80s, a used 606 could be found for as little as $50 in a pawn shop, at the present time, 606s are listing for anywhere between $600 and $1,100 on eBay, depending on the condition of the instrument. The 606 has spawned a number of clones, including most recently the Behringer RD6 and the Dinsink RE606. Sampled versions of its sounds are now a staple of the libraries bundled with digital audio workstations such as Ableton 10. Over the years, the 606 has proven itself as a surprisingly versatile and evocative instrument, and if you own an original, it makes sense to protect your investment by maintaining it in good working order. As OG 606s are getting close to 40 years old, it's not surprising that more and more of them are turning up with issues. In this video, we're going to address one of the liabilities of any electronic instrument of this vintage, the electrolytic capacitors. Before we begin, a brief disclaimer. This video will describe a full recapping of a 606, that is to say, replacement of each and every electrolytic capacitor in the instrument. While there are reasons to be wary of 40-year-old electrolytics, this video should be regarded as an illustration for entertainment and educational purposes, rather than a prescription or recommendation. I'm performing this operation on my own 606, an instrument I've owned since the early 90s, because I want to keep the instrument running in tip-top shape for another 40 years. Working on a machine of this vintage is not without risk, and a popular school of thought, not without merit, is that, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Hopefully this video will be informative and provide a guide for anyone contemplating a similar endeavor with their own 606, either on their own or with the assistance of an appropriately trained technician. As you'll see, there's quite a bit of labor involved. Although the process isn't complex, you could end up damaging your instrument if you try this yourself. I sped up the film as much as tenfold in certain sections, which has allowed me to share the entire process in this one video. Capacitors consist of two conductive plates separated by a non-conductive dielectric. They have the ability to accumulate and hold a DC potential and can be used to filter DC voltage while allowing AC voltage to pass through them. Electrolytic capacitors are a class of polarized capacitors due to their asymmetrical construction. Aluminum electrolytic capacitors, such as found in vintage electronic instruments, consist of an aluminum foil anode and an aluminum oxide non-conductive dielectric. This dielectric layer, essential to the capacitor's function, is incredibly thin and fragile. The non-conductive dielectric is in physical contact with a conductive electrolyte layer, hence the name electrolytic, that in turn is in contact with the capacitor's aluminum cathodes. In early electrolytic capacitors, the electrolyte consisted of an aqueous solution, often containing borax, or sodium tetraborate, an alkaline salt. Highly corrosive, this material is famous for leaking out of electrolytic capacitors with disastrous consequences. Electrolyte from leaking capacitors can make short work of copper traces on PCBs and will eat right through component leads and any other metal it comes in contact with. The aqueous component of electrolyte can evaporate, leaving the capacitor dry and increasingly ineffective. This gives rise to a condition which is inconveniently and somewhat confusingly described as leaking, whereby the dry capacitor becomes increasingly unable to store charge and transitions to a state where it resembles a large value resistor and leaks DC. So electrolytic capacitors can be both physically leaky, spilling electrolyte, or electrically leaky, passing current. These properties helped catalyze the development of electrolytic capacitors containing a dry electrolyte in the form of polymeric solids, Unfortunately for the vintage electronic enthusiast, these improved electrolytic capacitors didn't become widely available till the mid-1980s and weren't used in much of the equipment that we would concern ourselves with today. To add insult to injury, aluminum electrolytics can fail as a result of nothing more than the passage of time. Over time, the thin oxide coating on aluminum electrolytics will spontaneously degrade until holes in the dielectric form, essentially shorting out the capacitor. In a typical use case, in which an instrument may be used daily, weekly, or even once every month or so, these holes will heal during the course of regular use as the capacitor reforms under load. However, if instruments are left unused for long periods of time, unused wet electrolytic capacitors have been known to fail after as little as 1 year of storage. So as we see, there are several failure modes for electrolytic capacitors, some more obvious than others, ranging from modest reductions in capacitance to literally exploding as hot electrolyte boils under pressure, bursting the capacitor's enclosure. It's in an effort to avoid the more dramatic failure modes that we can begin to justify proactive recapping. The capacitors in vintage Roland XOX boxes, such as the 606, were typically made by either Nippon Chemicon, more recently known as United Chemicon, or Sanyo, who later sold the bulk of the capacitor business to Panasonic. These are good, reputable brands, and it's because of the high quality of the original components that so many 808s, 909s, 303s, and the like can be found working today. Notwithstanding the fact that I've yet to see an XOX box with a catastrophic electrolyte failure, I've also not yet recapped an XOX box that did not have several faulty electrolytics hiding amongst the good ones. So the approach taken in this video could be regarded as one very conservative approach to preventative maintenance, which I've embraced for illustrative purposes. The diagram on your screen is derived from the Roland TR606 service manual and shows the 3 PCB panels that comprise the 606, with the electrolytics color-coded by value. The 606 has, according to my count, 68 electrolytic capacitors. The PCBs have traces on one side and a ground plane on the component side. You can see me here removing capacitors by hand, one by one, and removing the solder using solder wick. This video is sped up about 10 times, and the capacitor removal portion alone represents about 2 hours worth of work. Replacing the capacitors took just slightly longer, another 2 hours or so, and I've slowed down portions of that process to allow you to follow along more easily. Okay, since we last saw one another a few moments ago, I have cleaned the PCB. You'll recall there was a tremendous amount of flux in this area here where a previous repair had been done, and as well, since I've removed all the electrolytic capacitors, I want to be able to solder them in and get good connections. So I cleaned all the flux off of the board, as well as this kind of strange coating that Roland seems to have used on some of their boards, which comes off as a sort of a brownish urine colored goo when you use flux remover to take it off the board. Also cleaned all the switches. I used a little deoxit on the switches and all the various connectors. Have not touched the potentiometers. We'll see once we've put the machine back together and are testing it if any of the pots need cleaning. Now we're going to repopulate the board with capacitors. And I do have an assortment of these Nichicon fine gold audio grade capacitors, which I have set aside for this refurbishment. However, there are certain positions where it's absolutely unnecessary to use this quality, and one of these places is in the switchboard where there's 3 electrolytics that really have nothing to do with the sound of the instrument, and so I'll be using some, I believe these are Rubicons. They're Rubicons. They're not quite as high grade as the Nichicon Fine Gold series, but they'll be perfectly adequate for this application. And so we need 3 caps. We need a 1 microfarad, a 10 microfarad, and a 100 microfarad capacitor. So here's our 1 mic. Oh, this is a Mallory. Again, this will be fine. This is a Rubicon 100 microfarad at 16 volts, which again will be fine in this position. This is just a switching position, and the cap that it is replacing is a 16 volt, and this is similarly a 16 volt cap. And finally, we need the 10, and this is a Rubicon 10 at 50 volts, fine for this purpose. And where are we? This is the 1 microfarad, and the positive lead is the longer of the 2 leads, and of course negative is indicated by the thick white stripe, but you always need to double check that. Now, what's strange about this picture? Well, one of the things that's strange about this picture is this capacitor is extending from the board further than the LED. So what does that mean? It means we need to make sure that we install it so that we can bend it so that it fits into the enclosure, and be mindful of that potential throughout. And the 10 is over here, C402, and similarly this could be an issue if we were to leave that there. And then we have C403, and similarly we're going to have to install this just so and bend it so that it fits into the enclosure. So all that being said, that, for example, should be fine. If we were to bend the cap leads so that it sits like that, that would be fine. Similarly, bend this guy like so, and bend this guy like so. And it's really best practice to make these adjustments before you actually do your soldering. And that should be fine. Lightly tack one lead on, then the other, and then come back and resolder that in a moment. Of course, always be careful, you know, where your clipped leads end up. You don't want to be reassembling the instrument and finding out that after the fact that they've been rattling around inside the instrument, shorting things out. Managed to create quite the little solder bridge here, so we're going to get rid of that. All right, this is being awkward. Of course, this is a lot easier without having to work around cameras and lights, but nonetheless, I'll stop making excuses. There we are. Okay, oops. So we have our capacitors installed in such a way that we can reassemble the instrument without too much difficulty, more so we think. Next we'll move on to the subboard. We've done a visual inspection on the subboard, which contains the high tom, low tom, and the headphone amplifier. This is the headphone amplifier here, this LA4140 chip. It also contains what was the largest capacitor in the instrument, which was this 1000 microfarad capacitor right here, which sits here on the board and points straight down. And it is about as big as it can be and still fit. In fact, maybe it's even too big, and looks a little swollen on the bottom, although it tested fine. This is about as big as it can be and still fit. So what we're going to do actually is replace this with a capacitor that's actually a little larger. And the reason why we care so much about this capacitor is because it sits right here in this circuit and is on the output of the LA4140, which is the headphone amplifier. And so everything that you would hear is actually coming out of this or through this capacitor. And so we want to make sure that it is operating properly and that it's of the appropriate quality. And so we're going to be replacing it with this guy here, which is a a Nichicon fine gold audio grade capacitor, and it's a little larger than the one that came out of the instrument, and accordingly we need to make an adjustment if indeed this cap is going to fit. And all we're going to do is bend the leads, mount it similarly to how we mounted these guys here. So rather than it sitting straight up and down here and being too large for the board to sit properly on these standoffs, we're going to fold it so that it is lying like this. And there's plenty of room to do that without interfering with anything else that's going on in the instrument. So I think that might be the first thing that we do here, and we'll go from there. So negative lead short, positive lead long, and the positive lead goes towards the amplifier. And again, if we were to try to mount this like so, we would find that we wouldn't be able to properly mount the board on the standoffs. It would be proud, meaning that it would distend too far towards the other board. And so we're going to leave the leads long and bend them just enough so that the capacitor can be mounted like so. And then we'll come back after the fact with a little bit of silicon. And actually I'm going to change. These are the Nichicon Audio KA series, and these are rated to 105 degrees actually, and the fine golds are only rated to 85 degrees. So this is actually a capacitor that can put up with a little bit more abuse than the one that we were going to install. Being summoned. Okay, let's continue with the rest of the capacitors on the subboard. And if we examine the map here, we see that we've got 5 47 microfarad at 16 volts, and I've got these 47 at 25, and so I'll place these. C302, C306, C318. This one is reverse orientation. C324 and C326. Position a couple of these others. 308 and 309 are 1 microfarad, and these are 1 microfarad at 50 volts. 308 and 309. And this guy is a 10 microfarad at 16 volts. No, this guy will be 2.2. And he belongs here, C327. Got a 10 at 16, and that goes at C320. And C303 is a 0.47 microfarad. And these last two are 100s, 100 microfarads. And these are 10 volts, not 25 volts, but that's okay. C325, the ones that came out of here were 6.5 volts. So these are actually an upgrade, both in quality and in specification relative to what was in here. And the last one, C328, similarly 100 microfarads. Okay. Wow, does not want to heat up. There we go. Okay, that should be just fine. We'll mount properly, no problems. Now, this is wiggling around in space a little bit, so we're gonna try and clamp that down. This is GE Silicon 2. It's just the white color as opposed to this, which is the clear color. And this Silicon 2 is non-conductive and so is safe for this type of application. And we'll see if I can use a little skill and get some applied here to give this capacitor a bit of structural stability. And that should do it. That's it. That's all. All right, and this is as good a time as any to pause and wait until this silicon hardens up a little bit. Okay, 2.2. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 at 2.2. Six. Three, 4. Aha! A capacitor I failed to remove. We'll have to get that in a moment. And so there's a 2.2 microfarad cap right here that we neglected to remove earlier. So we'll get that right now if we can. Okay. Actually, in an abundance of caution, what we're going to do is desolder this properly. And the appropriate leads are these ones. There's our guy, 2.2. Okay. Okay, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Do these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 47s. One, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Right. 5, 10, 11, 12. Okay. Where do they go? They go here. C15. 80. C93 and C72. Ten microfarad. We have 1, 2, 3. 10 microfarad. C103. C105 and C101. Point 47 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. I believe this is C25. C31. C35. C42, and C46. $100 microfarads. We have 1, 2, 3. We'll come back to this one and this one. Okay. C6. C13. This one needs to be a little proud to escape the chip that is next to it. And this one here, C104. Okay, so the remaining two capacitors that we have to change are capacitor C27 and capacitor C9. So in the first case, C27 is a capacitor located here next to the 444Cs, the memory chips. And what this capacitor does, and it can be seen in the schematic, is it provides additional power during the battery change process so that you can change the batteries without losing all of your patterns. And a 100 microfarad capacitor should last roughly a day in terms of providing you with backup memory in the absence of any batteries. This capacitor had been replaced with one that was slightly larger, and we're going to again replace it with one that is a little bit larger still. The other capacitor in question is C9, which is a filtering capacitor for the 5-volt power supply, which is driving the microprocessor. Now this capacitor had been upgraded from 10 microfarads to 150 microfarads. And I know that that was done by the last person to service this instrument. And that is a friend of mine, a fellow named Chris Johnson, who lives just outside of Detroit. And this modification was done, back in the mid-90s. And it was done at that time to stabilize the power that's being provided to that microprocessor. So again, we're going to be upgrading that capacitor. So what do we have on hand in terms of suitable replacements? Not a lot. I've got two 220 microfarad capacitors that might fit the bill, unless I were to use another 1000 in the memory backup position. You can use as large a capacitor as you have room for. It's really up to you. And again, even though this is an audio grade capacitor, it should be adequate in this position for filtering the power supply. Let's see what else I have here before I commit. Got a 100 microfarad. Maybe I'll just use the 100 microfarad for the 5-volt power supply. This is a Rubicon. And so we're upgrading the filtering of that 5 volts by about 10-fold. And this is again C9. Takes care of that. And let's see if maybe we have room for, let's see if perhaps we have room for a 1000 microfarad capacitor across the backup memory, because that would be really nice if we can get substantially improved memory retention. So this capacitor needs to go in here, and yet this board needs to be, or will be, installed over here. You can see it's really quite bulky in comparison to everything that would be around it. You know, one thing I could do is I could strap it to the standoff and then run leads. I think what I may do is look for another capacitor that is more appropriately sized. This is 35 volt rating, which is much greater than what's needed here. We only really need a capacitor that's rated at maybe 6.3 or 10 volts, and as such we could find something that was quite a bit smaller. So in the meantime, I think I'll stick with a 100 microfarad capacitor, and that will get us going until such time as we can find something better. Here we go. And I'll install this. Okay, so this is our Roland TR606 recapped for the time being, until such time as I replace this backup power cap with something a little more substantial. But nonetheless, this gives us what we need to test the device. So we'll get our power supply and our headphones and see what's happening. Before I do that, I'm going to install the boards on the standoffs. And make sure they're oriented properly. This capacitor needs to move out of the way a bit, as does this one. What is preventing? Aha. Okay. Okay, that should. Well, that's all for today's video. That's a full recapping replacement of all the electrolytic capacitors in a Roland TR606. I hope it's been entertaining and informative. Have a great day. Thanks for watching.